afternoon, folks. This is Jonas Brasco, and this is the Fighting Game Banter Podcast. Here, we dive into the world of fighting games and talk about the development, growth, and the FGC. Good afternoon, folks. This is Jonas Brasco, and this is the Fighting Game Banter Podcast. Here, we dive into the world of fighting games and talk about the development, growth, and the FGC. This episode that we're about to hear is dealing with the Rumblefish ports, specifically the Rumblefish 2 port, but the company who programmed the game, Suncrest Games, 3Goo, and Dimps released both the Rumblefish 1 and the Rumblefish 2. So, fair warning, this is not about the original games developed by Dimps. This is about the ports specifically by Suncrest Games and published by 3Goo in 2022 and 2023. What if I told you I purchased a game in October of 2022 and I literally got it in January? It was 14 months before I got the collector's edition of the Rumblefish 2. Plus, it came with an original version of the Rumblefish. This is the 2004 version. And what I mean by original, I mean original. So this podcast is normally about the development, and this is the best way I can describe it. So what we're getting into is one of the reasons that I started the podcast in the first place. There's times where there's other people who go into certain things like at the very beginning of the process, or when something's bad at the very beginning, and then they'll come back to it towards the end. This one is about 14 months. This is a journey of 14 months from when I ordered the Rumblefish 2 Collector's Edition until legitimately today. I picked up the game this past Saturday, and I'm recording this podcast a little bit early because there is a storm system that is apparently supposed to arrive around Tuesday of this week, which would put it at pretty much the 9th of January. So even though this will be processed during the weekend of the 12th and 13th of January, I picked up the game on the 6th, and I'm doing this on the 8th. So this is a very, very fresh view of this game. Without further ado, let's get into the Rumblefish 2 Collector's Edition. Why I bought it, what happened when I got it, and then lastly, what was going on in between. Because it shouldn't have taken 14 months. What exactly happened in the 14 months? That's what makes this all interesting. So to make a long story short, I live in the United States, so this is a North American thing. The Rumblefish originally was released in Japan in arcades in 2004. There became a PlayStation 2 version, but it was exclusive to Japan. Now they would make the Rumblefish 2 a year later in 2005. Once again, a Japanese exclusive. In 2012, they would re-release the Rumblefish 2 for arcades, but it would be using the new NesicaXLive system, which would allow you to play the same game, but in different arcades. With that being said, the game still didn't make it over here unless you bought an import or someone just had to have a Rumblefish 2 arcade board or candy cap. And that's how I experienced the game. There's a gentleman who comes to Animazement, our local anime convention in Raleigh, North Carolina, that happened to have a Rumblefish 2 cap. I was able to give it a try, and while the mechanics were kind of new to me, I instantly fell in love. I love the speed of the game. The kind of puppetry of the characters was something to get used to because it's not your traditional 3D or hand draw sprites. They kind of cel shaded a certain part of the body, and then it just kind of moved around like a puppet. The legs were different versus the arms and the head. Think of it almost like if you were using Flash animation or Adobe character or anime. Despite that, I enjoyed it. The pandemic would come along, and a lot of fighting games at that time were delay-based netcode. That wasn't going to fly. So in 2020, I was primarily playing Samurai Showdown. I was going to my locals, I was competing, I was getting bodied. I was definitely one of those O2 people. But then the pandemic came and it was bad trying to play online. There's just no way of escaping that there is a difference between delay-based netcode and rollback netcode. So I still wanted to play things, but Samurai Showdown was no longer an option. So I looked into games that had rollback netcode that I could play. I discovered Fightcade, and that's how I was able to play the Rumblefish 2 again. Now, granted, because this is not a NesicaXLive, this is the original Atomiswave version. So it did have some bugs and balance issues that the 2012 version addressed. Despite all those things, I was able to play the game. I was able to learn more about the mechanics. The Rumblefish 2 and other fighting games with rollback netcode like Fighting EX Lair and Melty Blood, which would be released later on, really helped me through the pandemic. And in a future episode, I will talk about Fightcade pretty much being the MVP for the FGC during the height of the pandemic. To make a long story short, the Rumblefish was one of those games where it helped me through the pandemic and I had an absolute blast playing it. So when I heard that they were going to make a Rumblefish 2 port that would actually be released in North America, I jumped on the bandwagon. So I live in North Carolina. I am about 35 minutes away from the Limited Run retail store. And Limited Run was going to be the publisher for the game here in North America. So anyone who ordered the collector's edition or even bought the basic retail edition was buying it from Limited Run. Because pre-orders were very limited, I pre-ordered the game, paid for it in full in October of 2022. A little more than 2 months later, they released the Rumblefish 2 digitally on PlayStation, Steam, and the Nintendo Switch. And this was a problem. For starters, before I get started with saying any type of criticisms, I need to point out one important thing. This game was never play tested. There was no beta, there was no playtest, there was no demo, which was the first red flag at that time. So when the game was released digitally, people jumped at the opportunity to play the game. The problem with this is that the game was not complete. Well, actually, that's not the first problem. The first problem was definitely the price. The price was $29.99 for a game that was nearly 20 years old. They bragged about the rollback netcode. They did have it. They mentioned that they would have all the characters. They did technically have that. However, they put 3 of the boss characters behind a paywall. So you didn't get all the roster, which happened to be unlocked in the first place in the NesicaXLive version of the game, which is what they were using. Now, the Atomiswave version, yes, the boss characters you had to unlock. Even still, it wasn't behind a paywall. So each character costs $3.99. So you are paying an additional $12 on top of the $29.99 to pretty much have the full version of the game. Pretty much $42 plus tax to have everything unlocked and ready to go for a game that was 18 years old at the time. People were not thrilled about that. To move on to the net play, let's start with the other thing that they bragged about, is that they would have the game widescreen. Now, normally that wouldn't be a problem, except the game was initially released in 4:3, and it was not made for 16:9, which means you could not play competitively, because there are combos and things that will not work in a 16:9 format. There are combos that literally rely on actually the opponent hitting the corner and having the ability to juggle them, or even do corner carry combos. So those things were completely shot out the window. Now, the company Suncrest Games did not understand this. Before I move any further, I need to mention 2 things. One, they claimed about 20 years of emulation experience. However, this was their first game. They were a company out of Spain. This is the first game that they did. I'm willing to give a little bit of leniency there, but it was very clear from the get-go that they did not know or they did not interact with actual fighting game people. So this is why the first red flag was the fact that they didn't do a play test. They didn't do any type of quality control to be like, hey, guess what? We kind of need to do this because this is how the game is originally supposed to be played. That didn't happen. The next thing was you have all these people who have bought this game and they want to play other people. There were no lobbies. There is no way to control or invite people to even a private room to play them. There was a quick match screen. You hope that you get somebody and then you play around. It is one game. And then afterwards, there was no option for a rematch. You're kicked out and they say, game over. Thank you for playing. And that is it. And that whole widescreen thing that I mentioned, that was there. Not only do you not get to rematch or even choose or invite someone to play with you, it is completely random. And even if you do find someone to play, you only get to play them once and then they kick you out. And then you just have to randomly hope you get to play them again to get some sort of rematch. So that part was completely shot. Needless to say, it is easily one of the most negatively reviewed for a fighting game that I have ever seen. Last time I checked Steam, it was at 37%. God of Rock and Omen of Sorrow aren't even that low. Qbyte out of Brazil basically put online, don't worry, we're going to release a full game. And they had a game that was actually older than the Rumblefish too. They had Breakers and Breakers Revenge, both originally Neo Geo games that were released in 95 and 96. And that was more of a complete game. And what I mean by complete, I mean they did play tests. They did beta tests. The game came out right out of the box with rollback netcode, crossplay, and lobbies. They made it clear this is a complete game. And did I mention also, it got everybody and it was cheaper. It was $19.99. You didn't have to pay for bosses. You weren't hoping for a lot of patches. It's like you literally got a complete game. And yes, there was a collector's edition of that too. It was the fact that I could only pick one and I ended up choosing the Rumblefish over Breakers. The point of this is not to, again, dish the Rumblefish, the game itself. It really is just how the port was presented. So needless to say, people were not pleased. I saw more refunds of the Rumblefish 2 on Steam than any other fighting game that I've ever seen in my life. If you go to the Rumblefish 2 Steam page, even with all the things that have corrected over time, it's still considered negative. So I should start with what they did correct. They did add a 4x3 bounding area. So you could choose to play in widescreen or you can choose to play in 4:3. They still did not give you online lobbies. They gave you what is known as online spectator mode. For those who don't understand or have heard of this, this can be seen in fighting games like Fighting EX Lair and Idle Showdown. Essentially, there is a private room with a host and there are what's known as spectators. It is not an open lobby. You cannot just get online and go into it. It is a private lobby with the codes to access. And I can't even call it a lobby because depending on the game, it really is legitimately a host and two spectators. So that's kind of what is going to happen there. Idle Showdown allows 5 spectators, but the same premise is still there. At best, the Rumblefish got themselves up to Fighting EX Lair quality, except you could play as the bosses in Fighting EX Lair from the very beginning. Host and spectator mode, they allowed you to pick short. But if you go to the quick match and you try to play a quick match against someone just randomly online, you don't get that choice. It even says these matches will always be wide. So needless to say, unless you have someone who has the game and wants to play that, it's dead. Ranked match, online leaderboards, all of that is pretty much gone. The online leaderboards are really just survival and time attack. That is it. I'm not even worried about crossplay or cross progress or anything like that. The issue becomes that when the game was supposed to be launched, they mentioned online lobbies, not online PvP. That's the words they're using now, but they claimed online lobbies. And private rooms where you can have spectators are not lobbies. No matter what type of semantics you try to put on it, it is not a lobby. Let's not even pretend on that level. especially if even the quick match, you still can't play the game how it was originally meant to be played. With all this being said, I'm like, okay, this kind of sucks a bit, but it's okay. When I get my collector's edition, I'll at least be able to play the original Rumblefish, which I never had access or the ability to play previously. So this goes back to last week, where I got my copy of the Rumblefish back in January, along with my collector's edition of the Rumblefish 2. It updated with all the patchwork that they did for the Steam version and everything current, plus I already had the 3 boss characters without paying additional. Now, I didn't know that was going to be the case when I bought the game. I legitimately thought it was just going to be these characters were unlocked out the box, a la like KOF 13 style, where instead of having to grind, you could just pay the money to unlock the characters and be done. I didn't know that they were going to be put behind a paywall altogether, that there was no way to just grind in the game and find a way to unlock the characters. Needless to say, or even just something simple like you beat the game and if you get a certain grade, you face Greed, or if you get a certain grade, you play Hazama, or you get a certain grade, you play Beatrice. And if you don't drop around, you get Beatrice. If you don't drop around, you get Greed. If you don't drop around, you get Hazama. That was the thing I was personally thinking. Now, in December of 2023, they released Rumblefish Plus, which was a increased featured version of the Rumblefish. It was going to include online play, it was going to include leaderboards, it was going to include replay, a more robust training mode where you can see and track down your inputs. With the training mode, you can record CPU behavior so you can have a better idea how to address things. All that was good. The problem is, I got my collector's edition in January, while my edition of the Rumblefish 2 patched himself all the way to where it was supposed to be. My edition of the Rumblefish is completely arcade stock. No special modes, no online. It's the game, it's local versus, and that's it. Plus, you could go online with it, and it was 4:3 by default. There was no, we're going to make this widescreen. They were like, nope, it's just 4:3, and it's a better online experience versus the Rumblefish 2. I contacted 3Goop and asked if I could upgrade my edition, but the answer is no. That edition is exactly what is listed on the collector's edition. And if you wanted to play Rumblefish Plus, I would have to purchase it for an additional $8. Now, the problem was I have no issue with the price. I want to go ahead and start and mention that right there. I can't help but to feel that if you bought the collector's edition, if you gave you a copy of the Rumblefish, just like you're adding patches and stuff to the Rumblefish 2, I think you can give people a free upgrade to the Rumblefish Plus. Considering how long people have had to wait, what happened with the launch of the Rumblefish 2, I think it would just been a good idea and maybe have some good graces to end this whole saga. So I had to decide if I wanted to pay the $8 or not. I chose to pay the $8, but not actually pay the $8. Luckily, I actually had some PlayStation credit that covered it, so I didn't actually pay anything out of pocket. The fact of the matter is, this is a complete story. In order to complete the story, I had to purchase everything. That's the only way I could truly complete and end the story. And the Rumblefish Plus is good. Not the port, but the game and the features are fine for that. Like, that should have been the bare minimum you got at launch. Have the 4:3 option by default. Be able to play people in 4:3 online, whether it's a quick match or the online PvP spectator by default. I don't know how many people are going to purchase the Rumblefish Plus because of everything that happened with the Rumblefish 2 port. I can say that if you want to experience and see how the differences in the implementing of the mechanics between the Rumblefish and the Rumblefish 2, then I think it's worth trying for $8. Which comes to pretty much the end of this story. If someone were to ask me, would I recommend this to anybody? the answer is both yes and no. From a sheer gameplay standpoint, I would have to admit that these are the best versions of the Rumblefish and the Rumblefish 2 that you can get here in North America and most regions around the world that do not have access to a NesicaXLive cabinet. Beyond that, I think that the ports were not executed to the level that they could have been. And this is where I do have a little bit of bias. Had the Breakers Collection not come out a few months later from the launch of the Rumblefish to digital, I maybe wouldn't have had as much of an issue. But Qbyte showed what a complete port release should look like, what features it should offer, a price point that should be offered. It gave you a complete game. And the game that I mentioned in my last podcast, Pocket Bravery, it's not a port. Even then, it had the rollback netcode. It had the lobbies. You had the ability to unlock both the boss and an extra character. They have frame data. They have hitboxes. None of that existed there. However, if you actually play the Fightcade version that's based off of the Atomiswave, you get those options. And this is done through Fightcast. This is not me saying don't pay for the Rumblefish and go play the Fightcade version. This is me saying that if you want the experience, if you want to know why there's people who do love the Rumblefish, this would be a good exploration. Now, if you want to go to tournaments and play the game, then yes, I would then mention the possibility of purchasing the port. If you want the collector's edition, where you would get to play the Rumblefish, it's the stock Rumblefish, but you can get those easily through Amazon and other retailers. And you do get some nice features like a art book, move list cards, a soundtrack for the original Rumblefish, which they pretty much reused for Rumblefish 2. A guide that kind of helps you through the mechanics and suggestions on how to actually play the game, which of course fighting games don't have guides now, at least not the big booklet, the Prima booklet ones like you got with like the original Mortal Kombat up to Mortal Kombat 3 and Tekken, you know, because of patch culture. It's fine for that because they were never going to actually mess with the balance or patch the moves or anything along that nature or change the mechanics. None of that was going to happen, so having a book like that makes sense. Beyond that, I can't say whether you should or should not buy the port. It is a personal preference. Once again, I wanted to illustrate that all of this commentary, criticism is about the port. It's not about the initial release. It's not about the NesicaXLive arcade version. It is legitimately about the ports that was released in 2022 and 2023. But if I was going to suggest anything, please put a patch in so that I could have random matches, quick matches with people in 4:3 and not widescreen, because you've pretty much made this a Discord game on arrival. You could also, there is a Rumblefish 2 Discord. I will put the link in the description. You can find matches both on Fightcade and for the Atomiswave version. There are plenty of people who will play you. The one issue and why the quick match and lobby thing is a big deal is that they have to friend you. In order to play these people in the port, both Rumblefish and Rumblefish 2, they have to friend you. And so you want to play someone randomly, it's like you have to make them your friend so you can go in and do a host spectator match or a host spectator match. But you can play the port at locals. I think for locals, the gameplay and stuff is one. And that's what makes this so frustrating, is I absolutely love this game and love this series. Altogether, I have spent over $120 for everything. I have 2 versions of Rumblefish 2. I now technically have 2 versions of Rumblefish. I have the bells and whistles of the soundtrack, the match cards, the art book, etc. Plus, of course, taxes and shipping and handling. I have not paid that much for anything in that time period from October 2022 to current. If that doesn't show you how much I love this series, or I have no idea what will. I literally went through all of this for the love of the game. outside of the SNK franchises that I grew up on, Fatal Fury, King of Fighters, Samurai Showdown, Last Blade, all of them are above the Rumblefish series, but everything else, for me personally, is below the Rumblefish series. And that's why how this port was handled affected me so much. Why I was willing to go through all 14 months of this. And at the end of the day, I have to ask myself, was this all worth it? And the amazing thing, it was. I may hate what these people did to these ports, how they treated it, and the features that they added or did not add, but I know that at this time, these are the best versions of the games that I am going to be able to play. The quintessential love-hate relationship. And what I mean by that is, I loved the game. I hated how the game was treated. So I want you to know that no matter how something is treated, localized, or released absolutely bare bones, if you love the game, play the game regardless. That is what I have learned from this experience. This concludes this episode of the Fighting Game Banter podcast. There's nothing more I can really say except I do want other people to experience this game. Maybe not see it exactly the way I do, but I know it can come off better than how it was presented. I really tried my best not to make this a slam piece, not cuss or feel like I'm just pointing fingers and yelling. I didn't want to do any of that. I wanted to make it clear I was disappointed in the port, but I didn't want to put any blame on the game itself. I also had to recognize that if they didn't do any of this, I wouldn't be able to play it, period. I still will jump into Fightcade, I'll play the Atomiswave version, and I will still have fun. So when people talk about, hey, you're pirating games, no, you see how much I dropped in this? So yes, if you feel not compelled to purchase this and you just want to play the one you can play on Fightcade, I would not blame you one bit. I will hop on Steam and I will look at the numbers, and yeah, they'll be playing, but they're nowhere near the numbers that are off of Fightcade. That's why people are there. People want to play stuff with minimum standards, mind you. There is a legitimate minimum standard that companies should look at that these people want to follow. Let's not forget, a lot of these games got re-released, got ports because of the pandemic and because of Fightcade. It legitimately showed that people want to play these games because they didn't get a chance at the time. There is no Capcom Fighting Collection without Fightcade. There is no Breakers Collection without Fightcade. And there is no Rumblefish without Fightcade. If nothing else, look at how people play the game on Fightcade. If you can't do the bare minimum that the developers of Fightcade can do, then don't waste your time. You go on YouTube, you look at Twitter, past Twitter, yes, and I'm saying Twitter instead of X, because when the turning to X, very few people were talking about the Rumblefish. That's kind of my point. It was essentially, they complained and it died. And it really did become a Discord game. I'm literally coming back 14 months later trying to say, I still love this game despite how much you tried to destroy it. Do what you will with this. I thank you all for listening. The next podcast is not going to be like this. Before I can move into 2024 and be objective and continue this podcast in a positive light, I had to address this. I had to close this chapter because it took up so much time. And even though I was able to play Melty Blood, even though I was able to play Pocket Bravery, and I had fun with those games, it was literally the dark cloud that loomed over me for 14 months, and I was not going to be able to deal with it until I got my hands and I could say the end. People that watch my stream or listen to this podcast should not be hearing me anymore complaining or constantly referring and comparing games to the Rumblefish 2 port. I'm not saying it won't happen, but it's not going to happen as often because I have come to terms with everything that has happened so I can move on. Thank you very much for listening. This is Jonas Brasco with the Fighting Game Banter podcast, and I'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Thank you for listening to the Fighting Game Banter podcast. Any inquiries for guests, questions can be reached at my email address, which is jonasbrasco@gmail.com. This podcast can be listened to on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and even TuneIn. For anything else, feel free to email me, and also check my social media, which is at Jonas Brasco on X/Twitter. Call it what you will. Thanks again for listening, and have a good day.